you have probably heard from your parents. And I'm sure you use the same phrases for your children and grandchildren. To just not talk to strangers, stay away from them. And obviously behind that admonition there are fears. There are fears that there may be a hidden agenda. We don't know what strangers might be up to. And sometimes, unfortunately, those fears are justified. With the news of so many vulnerable people, both children and adults, exploited through human trafficking by unscrupulous criminals, one wonders, especially nowadays, whom can one trust? The ever-swelling homeless population created not only by the economical downturn, but also by the rising cost of health care. And even worse, the breakdown on family and community relations is another place where human beings are transformed into strangers to one another, who are victimized and sometimes even criminalized. And what about immigrants, refugees, who look so different from us, truly strangers? Would we allow them to approach us? How would we react? Would we remember the biblical injunction to be kind to the stranger, repeated over and over again, but especially in the letter of Paul to the Hebrews, chapter 13, or even Jesus, Matthew 25? Would we react with the basic human values of understanding, hospitality, and compassion? So the Easter apparitions of Jesus that Luke reports, especially the passage that we read today, is obviously from a different time and a different place, a different culture altogether. And it is strange to see how Jesus speeds up to walk along the two on their way to Emmaus as they had left Jerusalem behind. And then he even intrudes in their conversation. It's hard for us Westerners of the 21st century imagine someone breaking in our conversation with a friend, a complete stranger. And yet that's what Jesus did. Completely different from what we know, from our culture. So we need to also consider that even for ourselves, there are walks that are difficult to make. Perhaps some are longer than others. Longer not just because of the distance, not just because of the landscape. Often because of the emotional status we are in. For the two walking to Emmaus, the news of the resurrection was a big puzzle, something so huge to wrap their minds around. Theirs has been a walk of hopes in shambles, a walk through the valley of disillusionment, a walk perhaps burdened by blame, guilt, reciprocal accusations. And now in the midst of all these feelings, they had to deal with the apparently unbelievable news of Jesus' resurrection as reported by women. So strange in that culture. And the conclusion that the news is unbelievable and unacceptable is proven by the fact that they abandoned the community of the disciples and walk away from Jerusalem. Are they even walking away from God? In arguments we have with one another, sometimes necessary and important, human beings risk losing sight of each other. The more heated our discussions become, the more likely we are to disregard the human dimension of our common journey. In heated discussion, we tend to lift way up our interpretation of reality and put down the opinions of others, even to the point of not recognizing the humanity of the other. We don't acknowledge them as persons, but as strangers, so different and so separated from us, perhaps even enemies. In other words, others become to us as strangers we need to defend from and to win in verbal, if not even physical, battles. Sin is the product of delusional thinking, that we are separated and different from one another in our essence and in our oneness. Indeed, the news of the resurrection is too illogical to entertain. The disciples characterize the resurrection report of the women as unbelievable, perhaps reflecting their view that the women were suffering from a psychological disturbance. The term that Luke uses in his gospel is a medical term. It's sometimes translated as idle tale or nonsense, what the women had said. But in medical terms, it reflects to delirious babblings of very sick persons. But given the inability of the disciples to recognize Jesus, it would stand to reason that they would regard the women's testimony as nonsense. Perhaps it was not the women who were delirious. Facts, even the fact of the resurrection as reported by the women, are not enough. Because we know how easy it is for us to give our spin to facts, our own personal interpretation. And so perhaps the rest of the disciples, hearing the women talk that way, had somewhat of a justification to their critical thinking. And yet, as we soon will see, their own interpretation of their understanding of the facts needed to be corrected. Their foolishness is exposed by Jesus, who retells the story with different words, referring to the prophets. He tells them, you have misinterpreted scriptures and the prophets themselves. And because of their misinterpretation of scriptures, they would not see Jesus. They couldn't. But Jesus tells them it was necessary for Jesus to be killed, not because Jesus embraced in a masochistic way the way of the cross, not because the Father had offered him as a sacrificial lamb for the world to have, but simply because he was so determined to love that his love brought him to the cross. He so much loved the world. But can you imagine? If Jesus had not stopped the disciples and retold them the story, what would have happened to them? To us? If the story were not told, would we be here? Had they not accepted the stranger who came into their space, into their conversation, into their home, would have they eventually be exposed to the life-transforming experience of the resurrection? The disciples had the facts of the resurrection, but they wouldn't believe them. As a matter of fact, Those facts left them disturbed. And now they have a sermon by Jesus, a breaking open of the scriptures, and an explanation that he indeed had to suffer. And so they come to the house, break bread together. This is the first meal of Jesus, according to Luke, after his death and resurrection. Eugene Laverdiere, in his commentary to the Gospel of Luke, writes, "In sharing Jesus' meal, the disciples accept the attitude which was his as he entered into the Passion. With this, their eyes are finally opened and they recognize him, even as he vanishes from their sight. Those who open their table to the stranger and share their possessions and who take on the self-giving attitude of Jesus recognize the risen Lord and are reestablished in hope. Such is Luke's message to the persecuted and can no longer recognize the risen Lord as they have experienced him in the past. At the breaking of the bread, our eyes are open. We see what Jesus did for us. We are welcomed into his life. And so the Eucharist, the breaking of bread, the pouring of wine, which we will share in a few moments, becomes a meal of gratitude. The psalmist invited us to consider, what can I render back to God after all the blessings and grace God has given me? And so I will lift up the cup of salvation. I will give thanks to the Lord. The word Eucharist, you may know, in Greek means thank you. We celebrate a meal of gratitude as we consider the blessings of God. And so it is not so much anymore a sign of his sacrifice, which it is. So we don't approach the altar with this repentant heart. We also need to do that. But most of all, we approach the altar with this huge gratitude in our heart, with this joy in our heart, coming to receive this means of grace which we want to celebrate with joy. So when we come to the altar, it's okay to smile. It's okay to say thank you. And when we say Amen, we are saying more than thank you. Amen means so be it. Meaning we understand, our eyes are open, we receive Jesus' life, what he has done for us, we embrace it, and we are brought into this communion with Jesus, with the community, becoming one. Yes, Amen, I accept your gift, and I give my life. Poured out, broken for others. And so what happens after their eyes are opened? The translation we heard today is they got up. The word is they rise. A resurrection pose. They rise from the table and they run full of joy back to community, back to Jerusalem, back to God. In community, they decided one lives out the new reality of the resurrection. And we are so fortunate to have community with one another. Are we open to inviting the stranger? The one who comes along, who is announced as the stranger, becomes the host. We who declare others strangers become the ones who are fed. The host is that stranger, and we become members of one another. Let us bless God for the great gift of community, for the great gift of Holy Communion, for the great gift of the Spirit that makes us one. This one unity with one another and with God and the rest of the world. Amen.